What would you do if you woke up and found your private lake suddenly marked as HOA property? They thought a few stakes and a board vote could turn my private lake into their community asset. But when they built a power plant on the land my father left me, I knew I couldn't stay quiet. One night, I activated a system they never knew existed, and their entire project collapsed under the weight of the truth they tried to bury. The first cold breeze of early spring slid across the Wyoming foothills as I stepped off my porch, coffee steaming in my hand. The sun was barely cresting over the ridgeline, turning the frost-dusted grass into a sheet of faint gold. Mornings out here were usually quiet. Just the creak of timber fences, the low groan of my old ranch gate settling in the earth, and the soft lap of water against the shoreline below. It was the kind of silence that felt earned, like the land itself had granted you a small moment of peace. But that morning, something broke the silence. A splash of fluorescent pink flickered at the edge of my vision. Too bright, too artificial to belong in this place. I narrowed my eyes, thinking maybe it was a trick of the early light. But as I walked down the slope toward the lake, the shapes sharpened into reality. Survey flags, dozens of them. They were staked into the damp soil along the western bank, their plastic ribbons whipping in the wind like warning signals. And behind them stood a freshly planted metal sign, gleaming silver in the morning sun. The letters punched through my chest like a mule kick. Community Infrastructure Zone Authorized HOA Project. Do not remove. My jaw clenched before my brain even caught up. I stepped closer, boots sinking slightly into the soft earth that had always felt like home. The sign was new enough that I could still smell the metallic tang of fresh-cut aluminum. It was bolted into the ground with a kind of arrogant finality, the kind you'd expect to see on public land or government property. Not on my ranch, not on my lake. The lake stretched calm behind it, dark blue and still as glass. It had always been mine, literally mine, not in some poetic, sentimental way, but by deed, survey, and 40 years of quiet stewardship. My father, Thomas Cole, carved this lake out of stubborn Wyoming earth with his own hands back in the late 70s. He engineered the basin, shaped the shoreline, packed clay where it needed sealing, and set the first stone of the spillway. Every contour, every inch of water that glimmered under the rising sun existed, because he insisted a man should build something that outlasts him. And now fluorescent plastic ribbons were flapping across it like someone was claiming the land for themselves. I crouched and pinched one between my fingers. The ribbon crinkled sharply, cheap, weather-resistant, meant to stay in place for months. Beneath it, a wooden stake had been driven deep into the soil, deeper than any casual visitor or hiker would bother with. These were no markers for hikers, no temporary stakes for a weekend event. These were boundary lines. I straightened, letting the ribbon go. It snapped back in the wind, the sound small but sharp, the kind of sound that told you something was wrong. My first thought was that Bethany Reed, president of the West Ridge HOA, had finally gone too far. Over the past year, she'd been circling my ranch property like a hawk scanning for weakness. First, it was the dispute over road access, her insisting that the private dirt road leading to my ranch was functionally communal. Then it was her attempt to impose visual compliance guidelines on my barns because they were within the community view corridor. Both times I shut it down with paperwork, hard paperwork, deeds, plats, easements, things Bethany preferred to gloss over in favor of bylaws and majority votes. But this was different. This was a line drawn right into the earth. I walked the shoreline slowly, counting the flags out of instinct. 27, 28, 29. They traced a deliberate arc, slicing outward from the natural curve of the lake, nudging the imaginary border several yards into my land. No note, no email, no phone call, just flags. My phone vibrated in my pocket. A text from my neighbor, Tom Jensen, popped up. "Hey Remy, you see what HOA posted about the lake project?" I didn't answer. I kept walking. At the far edge of the arc stood a taller post, one of those temporary construction markers that contractors used for staging. The corner of a rolled-up laminated map flapped against it. I tugged it free. It showed a layout: pipes, a rectangular platform over the water, a grid of plotted measurements. The title at the top made my stomach tighten. West Ridge Community Micro Hydro Project, Phase 1. A micro hydropower station, on my lake. The wind picked up, rippling the water and rattling the sign behind me. The metal clanged softly against its own bolts. A taunt, almost. My coffee had gone cold in my hand. I turned toward the ridge, letting my eyes follow the line of mountains rising behind my ranch. My father used to say the mountains were his compass. If he could see them, he knew where he stood. But looking at those survey flags cutting into the land he'd shaped, I felt something tighten between my ribs. Why would the HOA dare claim a lake they had no rights to? Why now? Why me? Why this lake? The one place on my land they never touched. Until today. The cold breeze ran across the water again, carrying the faint metallic rattle of that sign. The sound crawled under my skin. I took a slow breath, letting the cold air sharpen my thoughts. I didn't know what they were planning, not yet. But I knew this much. If the HOA had decided my lake was suddenly community infrastructure, then someone in West Ridge was about to learn what real ownership meant, and I'd make sure they learned it the hard, legal, undeniable way. The wind shifted as I climbed back up the slope to my ranch house, carrying the scent of thawing pine and the faint metallic tang of early snowmelt. Inside, I set my cold mug down on the counter, pulled the deed folder from the drawer beneath the window, and spread the documents across the kitchen table. The paper had aged into a soft, warm beige over the decades, but my father's handwriting, careful block letters, neat margins, still looked as sharp as the day he drafted the first layout of the lake. His name, Thomas Cole, sat bold and unbothered on every page. Ownership. Clear, unbroken, undisputed. Until today, apparently. The old wall clock ticked behind me as I slid each page into a plastic sleeve. I wasn't angry yet, just steady, alert. The kind of feeling a rancher gets when a storm is too quiet to trust. By the time I zipped the folder shut, I'd already made up my mind to attend the HOA meeting scheduled for that afternoon at the West Ridge Community Hall. I wasn't a regular at those gatherings. In fact, I'd skipped most of them in the 8 years since my father passed, and I moved back to take over the ranch. But today demanded a presence and a voice. I arrived early, parking my dusty Silverado between a row of polished SUVs. The hall stood at the edge of the subdivision, a long, low building with white siding and a neatly painted blue trim. A fresh banner hung over the entrance. West Ridge HOA, monthly board session, community vision in action. I stepped inside. The smell of stale coffee and floor wax met me first, followed by the murmur of casual conversations. Residents filled the rows of metal folding chairs, chatting in soft voices. Some nodded politely as I walked past. Others looked away, the kind of sideways glance people give when they're not sure which side of a story to be on yet. At the front, a long table stretched across the stage. The board members sat behind it with papers neatly stacked in front of them. And in the center, wearing a navy blazer sharp enough to cut glass, sat Bethany Reed. Bethany was in her early 50s, though she carried herself like a senator waiting for cameras to roll. Her blonde hair was twisted into a low, immaculate bun. Her posture was a straight line, shoulders square, chin lifted, hands folded neatly as if she'd been born behind a podium. Her eyes flicked across the room like she was counting votes. When she saw me, her smile sharpened, though her eyes stayed cold. "Mr. Cole, she said, nodding slightly. Glad you could join us today. I didn't return the smile. Didn't think I had a choice. She gestured toward the seats. We're discussing new community projects. You're welcome to listen in. I chose a spot near the aisle, close enough to walk straight to the microphone when the time came. The clock struck 4. Bethany tapped her gavel lightly. Let's begin. The meeting opened with the usual HOA formalities: landscaping budgets, wildlife complaints, reminders about holiday decorations. People seemed half asleep until Bethany tapped her stack of papers with a manicured nail. Now, she said, to the exciting part. A ripple of anticipation passed through the crowd. As many of you know, West Ridge has been exploring sustainable energy solutions. After months of planning, we are proud to announce Phase 1 of our community micro hydropower initiative. Polite applause rose throughout the room. My jaw tightened. Bethany clicked a remote, and the projector hummed to life. A slide appeared, an aerial diagram of my lake, though labeled differently. West Ridge Water Asset, Parcel B. My fingers curled around the folder on my lap. Not a single person seemed to notice that the lake outline matched the one behind my ranch house. Bethany continued. This station will provide backup power during outages and reduce our reliance on the county grid. It will benefit all residents. I lifted my hand. She hesitated, briefly, visibly, before saying, Yes, Mr. Cole? I stood, folder in hand, and made my way to the microphone. I want to confirm something, I said calmly. This project, the one shown on that slide, it's planned for the lake behind my property, correct? She smiled, polite but sharp. It's planned for the community's Greenbelt waterway. It's my lake, I said. Cole Lake, built by my father. On my deed. Private property. A few whispers scattered across the room. Someone shifted in their chair. Bethany didn't blink. There appears to be some boundary ambiguity. There's no ambiguity. I unzipped the folder and lifted the first map. This is the original plat map from 1979. The lake sits entirely on Cole Ranch. My father built it. We've maintained it. It's private. Bethany gave a small laugh, the kind people use when trying to stay superior. Mr. Cole, the board's legal consultants have reviewed this matter. I haven't, I said, because no one notified me. She placed her hands flat on the table. The community has needs, and the lake provides a natural location for our renewable initiative. The HOA voted last quarter to proceed with exploratory surveys. You mean those pink flags hammered into my land this morning? Her lips tightened. Let's not exaggerate. I'm not exaggerating. I counted them. A few residents turned to look at her. Pressure built in the room like a slow leak of steam. I held up a page from the deed, my father's signature bold against the yellowed paper. This lake isn't yours to borrow, build on, or rename, and certainly not yours to designate as infrastructure. Bethany's smile returned, sharper than before. We'll let the board decide, Mr. Cole. That's how community governance works. It's how overreach works, I replied. A wave of whispers rolled through the hall. Bethany tapped her gavel once, not loudly, but sharply. Thank you for your input, she said, turning to another resident. Moving on. Just like that. Dismissed. I stared at her for a long second before stepping away from the microphone. The air felt heavier on the walk back to my seat, the way it feels before lightning strikes. People avoided my eyes or looked at me with that half-sorry, half-frightened expression that said they'd already been told a version of this story, and not by me. At the end of the meeting, as residents gathered their coats and purses, Bethany approached me. Remy, she said softly, lowering her voice, don't make this harder than it needs to be. The project benefits everyone. Not on my property. She tilted her head. Property lines shift, Interpretations evolve. Not these. Her smile didn't falter, but something flickered behind her eyes. Annoyance, maybe frustration. If you want to contest the project, she said, you can file an appeal with the board. The board that you chair? It's the proper process. I stepped closer. Then here's my proper process. I held up the deed folder. These papers aren't up for interpretation. Bethany leaned in, lowering her voice until only I could hear her. We'll see what the majority says. She walked away, heels tapping sharply on the wood floor, leaving the faint scent of lavender and a rising heat under my collar. As I stepped outside into the crisp Wyoming afternoon, the wind carried the smell of dust and pine once more. But it didn't feel peaceful now. It felt like a warning. If the HOA believed a vote could override 40 years of ownership, then this fight had just begun. And I wasn't about to lose what my father built, not to bylaws, not to bureaucracy, and definitely not to Bethany Reed. The gravel crunched under my boots as I crossed the yard toward my truck. The sky above the ridge was still a clean, deep blue, but something in the air felt unsettled, like the land itself was bracing for intrusion. I drove the short dirt road back to my house, trying to clear the tension from my shoulders. But the moment I rounded the hill and the lake came into view, my breath caught. Heavy machinery lined my shoreline. Not near it, not adjacent, on it. A white flatbed truck sat angled near the boat ramp, its tailgate lowered, carrying stacks of metal scaffolding. Beside it, a crane, an honest-to-God crane, extended its boom over the water, lowering some kind of prefabricated platform onto the lake's surface. Two pontoon barges bobbed unevenly beneath the weight of generators and a steel frame. Orange safety net fencing snaked along the dirt like a bright, ugly wound. And scattered across the shoreline were workers in reflective vests, walking my land like it belonged to them. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. I put the truck in park, stepped out, and the cold air slapped my face. The sounds hit next. The grind of engines, the slap of tools on metal, radios crackling with instructions. A place that had been silent at sunrise was now busy enough to fit a construction site in downtown Cheyenne. I walked down toward the water, boots digging into the earth, the ground still soft from yesterday's thaw. A man in an orange vest turned, saw me, and lifted a hand in a half wave. "Morning," he said, already looking past me toward the equipment. "Watch your step, we're staging." "On whose authority?" I asked. He blinked at me like he was trying to process a trick question. "HOA, West Ridge. They contracted our company last week." "This is private property," I said. "You can't stage equipment here." He pointed toward a laminated sheet clipped to a board. "Says here it's part of the community project zone. We were told the lake was under HOA management." "It isn't." A second worker called to him from the barge, and he jogged away, clearly done with the conversation. They had their orders, and none of them came from me. At the water's edge, I stooped and picked up another survey stake. This one was marked with fluorescent blue tape, different from the pink ones earlier. Blue meant utility placement, pipes, conduits, intake routing. They weren't planning this. They were building this. I pulled my phone out and dialed the non-emergency line for the county sheriff. The dispatcher answered with her usual calm. "Sheriff's office, what's your situation?" "This is Remy Cole out on Bramble Creek Road. I have construction crews trespassing on my lake. Heavy machinery. They claim the HOA authorized it. I need a deputy sent out." There was a pause, typing on a keyboard. "Is there a dangerous situation? Any weapons, threats, violence?" "No, just trespassing." Another pause. "Mr. Cole, this sounds like a civil dispute. Property line issue. HOA involvement. We can't intervene unless there's an immediate threat to safety. You'll need to resolve this through your attorney." A door shut softly inside my chest. "I have a deed," I said, quieter this time. "It's my land." "I understand, sir. But legally, If no one's endangering you, we can't remove them. You can document everything and take it to court. I stared at the shoreline, at the crane lowering steel into my water. Right, I murmured. The dispatcher apologized again, then ended the call. I let the phone fall to my side. For a long moment, all I could hear was the wind riffling through the dead reeds at the water's edge and the relentless beeping of a truck backing up. My father's work, decades of sweat, engineering, and stubborn love for this land, was being overshadowed by strangers who didn't know a thing about the lake, except that someone else told them they could take it. The generator's hum deepened as another machine flickered to life. I looked over my shoulder at the sign the HOA had posted earlier. It stood firm in the grass, its metal face catching the sun. West Ridge HOA Project Zone Unauthorized Entry Prohibited. They'd turned my property into a construction yard without even knocking on my door. I walked up the slope to the barn, my boots dragging slightly in the dirt, and grabbed my DSLR camera from a shelf above the tool bench. The lens was dusty, but it still worked fine. I snapped photo after photo: license plates, company logos, equipment serial numbers, the blue utility flags, the crane cables dipping into the water, even the workers knee-deep in the lake while they positioned a floating frame. Evidence. Every second of it. As I zoomed in on one photo, I noticed Bethany walking toward the site from the trail, connecting the subdivision to the lake. She wore a tailored coat, scarf neat around her neck, and clutched a clipboard against her chest like she'd rehearsed this moment. Her boots didn't sink into the mud the way mine did. She stepped lightly, as if she believed she belonged here. When she reached the edge of the fence line, she lifted her chin and looked across the shoreline with a quiet pride. She scribbled something on the clipboard before finally turning in my direction. Our eyes met. For a moment, neither of us spoke. She started walking toward me, boots tapping against the wooden deck of the old fishing platform my father built. The wind caught the ends of her hair, but she didn't bother brushing it away. "Busy morning, Remy," she said, unbothered. "What do you think you're doing?" "Advancing a community project." She gestured toward the barge where two workers were bolting something down. "This plant will give West Ridge clean, reliable backup power. On my lake." She offered a patient smile. "The board has determined that portions of the lake fall within the community's Greenbelt jurisdiction. Our consultants, it's on my deed." "There's a boundary discrepancy," she replied, voice soft, practiced. "Active review is underway." Review doesn't mean permission. Progress requires flexibility, Remy. I stepped forward, lowering my voice. And trespass requires consequences. Something flashed across her expression, annoyance, sharper this time, but she smoothed it quickly, adjusting the clipboard in her hands. "Look, the community voted on this. If you have concerns, the appeals process is clearly outlined in the bylaws. The bylaws don't override Wyoming property law. That's for the county to decide," she said, then motioned toward the machinery. "In the meantime, we're moving forward." I held up my camera. "I'm documenting everything." Her smile thinned. "Do as you wish." A gust of wind swept across the lake, carrying the cold sting of water mist and the smell of diesel. The crane's motor whined as it lifted another piece of steel toward the center of the lake. Bethany turned to leave. "You'll hear from my attorney," I said. She didn't look back. "I'm sure I will." I watched her walk away, clipboard tight in her hand, posture straight as a fence post. Behind her, the machinery groaned and clattered, slowly transforming my father's lake into their project site. The sky was starting to cloud over, a haze drifting across the sun. I stood still, letting the cold seep through my jacket. The land felt different under my boots. Less like a refuge, more like a line being drawn without my consent. If the law wasn't coming to stop them, then I needed another way. And I knew exactly where to start looking. I headed toward the old ranch house, its pine siding faded and sun-bleached, its porch creaking in the same familiar rhythm it always had. Inside, the air carried the scent of old cedar and dust. The floorboards groaned under my steps as I crossed into the den, the room where my father kept every blueprint, survey, and handwritten note he ever touched. The den was small but dense, a shrine to engineering stubbornness. Rolled maps stood upright in tall wooden crates. 3 cabinets overflowed with manila folders labeled in thick, blocky handwriting. A drafting table stood near the window, its surface marked by decades of pencil impressions and coffee rings. My father's slide rule still hung on the wall above it, idle but dignified. I hadn't opened most of these drawers in years, but now, the HOA's arrogance had forced me back into the archives my father once guarded like treasure. I pulled the first drawer open. Maps. Too many. The next drawer. More maps, plat overlays, soil analyses, hydrology charts. The third drawer stuck halfway, swollen from age. I yanked it free and papers slid like loose feathers across the floor. And there it was. A thick binder labeled in faded ink. Coal Lake. Structural Systems, 1981 to 1984. I lifted it onto the drafting table, the cover crackling as if relieved to be handled again. Inside, pages slept in plastic sleeves, corners curled with time but still intact. Blueprints, elevation plans, subsurface sketches, overflow channels, diagrams of pipes and culverts running beneath the ridge like arteries. My father's pen marks filled the margins. Measurements, warnings, reinforcement notes. I leaned closer. At first glance, it looked like any other small engineered lake. But the deeper I went through the pages, something else emerged. A subsystem I had forgotten existed. Emergency spillway. West access only. Certified 1983. Hydrological deviation, permit number 41B, a spillway. Not the visible one on the north end. This was different. This one connected to a reinforced culvert under the ridge, running half a mile west toward protected creek land. A safety valve for extreme overflows during historic floods or dam stress. I remembered my father pointing at the plans when I was a kid, tapping the blue lines with a calloused finger. Never build anything without an escape route, son. He built one for the lake itself. Hidden, private, legal, and registered under a federal runoff certification that hadn't expired. I kept turning pages. My pulse picked up. There it was, clearer than memory. Operational valve, manual crank authorized use by landowner only. Not an HOA structure. Not municipal. Private hydrological infrastructure. My hand stilled over the page. A valve. A crank, a system designed to lower water levels legally, predictably, safely, without breaching any environmental laws. My father had built it to protect the ranch in case of massive overflow. The HOA, in their arrogance, had built their equipment directly above it. The air felt thicker, the room warmer. The hum of possibility pressed on my chest. I didn't need to fight their construction head-on. I didn't need a deputy who wouldn't come, or a board vote already decided. I just needed to understand everything my father left behind. My next call was obvious. I grabbed my phone and dialed a number I'd saved years ago. "Sarah Mitchell," a woman answered, her voice steady, crisp. "Sarah, it's Remy Cole." A brief pause. "I figured I'd hear from you today." "You heard?" "Half the county heard, Remy. HOA thinks they've discovered hydropower. That alone says they're desperate." I let out a dry breath. Sarah wasn't just any lawyer. She specialized in water rights, easements, and land disputes across Wyoming and Montana. She was sharp, methodical, and allergic to HOA theatrics. "I found something," I said. "Something my father built. A private water control system. Registered, certified. Send it." I snapped photos of the blueprints and legal certificates, one by one. The pages were yellowed, but the county seals and signatures were unmistakable. When I emailed the files, her response came within minutes. "This is real," she said over the phone. "And it's strong. Stronger than anything the HOA will admit. They've already started building." That's not surprising. HOA boards like Bethany's. They overstep, pray nobody knows their rights, and hope to create facts on the ground before a court can intervene. I moved to the window. Outside, the lake shimmered under a thin veil of cloud, unaware of the steel structures now anchored on its skin. "Can I use this?" I asked. "You're the landowner," Sarah replied. "If the structure is yours and it's legally registered, you can operate it, you can document it, and you can defend it." Her voice softened, but only slightly. "Just don't confront them physically, Remy. Let the paperwork do the punching." I nodded, though she couldn't see it. "What's my next move?" Her answer was quiet, deliberate. "Prepare. Observe. Let them think you're boxed in." I closed the binder gently and ran my hand across the cracked leather cover. "Sarah," I asked, "what if they keep going?" A breath. "Then eventually, they'll create a problem only you can fix." "And when that happens?" She paused before speaking again, soft but razor sharp. "If it's yours, you're allowed to use it." When the call ended, the den was silent again. Outside, the wind pushed ripples across the lake's surface, scattering the reflection of the crane that didn't belong there. I stood alone with the binder, the weight of 40 years pressing on my palms. They thought they'd found a loophole. They had no idea what kind of engineer my father was, and they had absolutely no idea what he'd built into the bones of this lake. Not yet. The next morning arrived gray and heavy, the kind of Wyoming dawn where clouds hung low enough to scrape the ridge and the air held the metallic taste of coming weather. I stepped out onto the porch with a cup of black coffee and watched the mist drift over the water. From a distance, the lake looked quiet, almost peaceful, like it always had before sunrise. But beneath that calm lay a new kind of tension, a tightening, a waiting. I wasn't the only thing awake. Machinery rumbled on the opposite shore, the kind of low, steady vibration you could feel in the wooden boards under your boots. The HOA wasn't slowing down. In fact, they'd doubled their effort. 2 more trucks had rolled in overnight. A floating barge had been anchored closer to mid-lake. Cables stretched across the water like thin silver scars. I raised my camera and took slow, deliberate shots. Frames of the equipment, the workers, the concrete forms stacked too close to my shoreline. The mist curled around them, softening their edges but not their intrusion. This time, though, I didn't storm down the hill. I didn't shout. I didn't call the sheriff again. I stayed still, deliberately still. Let them think the fight had drained out of me. Let them believe yesterday's pushback was all I had in me. Let them assume I was tired, defeated, resigned. Sometimes silence makes more noise than anything. Around mid-morning, I walked down to the barn and unlocked the old tack room. Inside, the smell of oiled leather and timber rose like a memory. I retrieved my father's field notebook, the one he used when he checked the lake's drainage systems, and slid it into my jacket. The cover was cracked and soft with age. His handwriting filled every page, notes about water levels, pressure readings, storm runoff, seasonal changes. He always said the land kept its history. You just had to know where to look to read it. Outside the barn, the wind picked up, carrying dust along the dry patches of the path. I walked slowly toward the lake, not to intervene but simply to observe. If Bethany or her contractors noticed me, I didn't give them the satisfaction of reacting. I stood at a distance, hands in my pockets, like a man who'd finally accepted the inevitable. Truth was, I was cataloging everything. The crane boom swung across the sky, lowering a steel housing onto the barge. Workers shouted measurements back and forth, their voices bouncing off the water. The generator thumped to life with a deep, rhythmic pulse. Even the ducks that lived along the reeds seemed confused, their wings slapping water as they flew away in wide arcs. I watched it all with a blank expression I'd learned from years of ranching, calm on the outside, calculating beneath. The spillway access hatch lay hidden beneath the thick brush near the western ridge. No one would find it unless they knew exactly where to step. My father had placed it behind an old service shed he built in '83. To anyone passing by, the shed looked abandoned, tilted slightly, door hanging crooked, as if time had quietly won. But beneath that shed was a system more reliable than any of the machinery the HOA was bolting into place. I ran my fingers along the old lock. I didn't open it. Not yet. Timing mattered. Impact mattered. Legality mattered even more. For now, staying quiet was my greatest weapon. Just before noon, I walked back toward the house and saw Tom Jensen at the fence line, his dog trotting beside him. Tom was in his 60s, wide-brim hat, hands roughened from a lifetime of weather and work. He rested his elbows on the fence rail. "Heard the HOA's making noise on your lake," he said casually. "Making more than noise." Tom spat into the dirt. "Bethany's been strutting around town saying she's reclaimed community resources. Folks have been asking what that means." "It means she's trespassing." "Yeah," Tom said with a long exhale. "That's what I figured." He glanced toward the water, his brows knit together. "You gonna push back?" "I already did," I said. "She didn't listen." Tom scratched the dog's ears. "Don't give her too much rope. She'll hang you with it." I almost smiled. Tom had lived next to the HOA's nonsense longer than anyone. He knew exactly how they operated. Ignore truth, bury dissent, move fast, apologize later. "I'm not giving her rope," I said. "I'm just giving her time." Tom raised an eyebrow but didn't ask more. He knew better than to pry into a battle he wasn't invited into. When he left, I went inside and placed the deed, the plat maps, and my father's binder neatly on the dining table. I ran a hand over the documents. Their edges were softened by years, but the truth inside them was solid, immovable. The HOA's power rested on perception, votes, newsletters, facades of authority. Mine rested on something far sturdier: law, land, and legacy. By late afternoon, the rhythm of construction changed. The machinery quieted, replaced by the clinking of metal tools and the scrape of scaffolding. Workers stepped off the barge and gathered on the shore, discussing the next phase. Bethany wasn't present, but her influence lingered in the confident pace of the men and the staked signs that now circled a portion of the lake like it belonged to someone else. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the water. I walked onto my deck, feeling the evening settle deep into the ranch. The lake reflected a streak of red across its surface, a bold slash of color that almost felt like an omen. I inhaled the cold, resin-scented air, and finally, I went quiet. I didn't call the HOA. I didn't call the sheriff. I didn't call Sarah again. She'd already given me what I needed. Sometimes, before a storm breaks, the wind stills, the air sinks, the whole world holds its breath. That evening, as the machinery shut down and the last truck rumbled away, leaving the lake to fall back under the soft cover of night, I left the lights off in the house. I let the land go dark. I let the silence expand. From across the water, the crane's silhouette stood tall against the fading sky, an ugly shape, temporary and flimsy compared to the mountains rising behind it. Let them keep building. Let them think I was beaten. Let them think I'd gone quiet because they'd won. Wyoming nights carry sound in a way no city ever will. When the wind lifted, I could hear the lake breathe again. The reeds rustled. The water lapped gently at the shore. And somewhere beneath, deep in the earth, the old spillway waited patiently for the hand that knew how to wake it. Not yet. but soon. Very soon. The next 48 hours passed with the slow, methodical weight of gathering thunder. The kind of tension you feel in your bones before a Wyoming storm. Not loud, not violent, just steady, creeping, inevitable. I worked through each day like a man moving through tall grass, careful not to disturb what was coming. The HOA mistook my quiet for defeat. Good. On the second evening, the sky turned the color of burnt copper as the sun dipped behind the ridge. I stood at my window, watching the construction lights flicker alive across the lake. Flood lamps bathed the water in harsh white, cutting through the night like prison beams. Men in reflective vests walked the perimeter of their floating platform, shouting instructions over the whine of generators. Their confidence bled into the air. They were close, too close, to finishing their foundations. Another day or two, and they'd start bolting down the turbine housing for good. Time was running thin. I grabbed my father's old field jacket from the peg by the door. The fabric was frayed around the cuffs, the pockets stiff from years of use, though, but it still smelled faintly of cedar and machine oil. I slipped it on and felt something settle across my shoulders. Weight, memory, responsibility. Outside, the cold bit sharper than usual, the kind of chill that pushes a man to stay moving. My boots crunched across the frost-crusted ground as I headed down toward the western edge of the lake, the part most people never bothered with, the part hidden beneath pines and brush. The wind whispered through the branches, rustling old needles across the ground, carrying with it the distant hum of the HOA's machinery. The sound grated against the quiet of the land. This place wasn't built for that kind of noise. My father shaped this lake for peace, for resilience, for legacy, not for someone's project with a ribbon-cutting ceremony. I reached the old service shed. In the daytime, the sagging roof and leaning frame made it look abandoned. But at night, under the faint glow of the moon, it resembled a sentinel, half hidden, half watching. A sliver of silver glinted beneath the door. I knelt, lifted the warped wood paneling, and exposed the rusted lock that guarded the spillway access. My father had installed the hatch behind the shed deliberately, out of view, under cover, protected. When I was 17, he'd brought me out here to help pour the concrete frame. His voice echoing in my mind, steady as bedrock. Always build an exit. Nature doesn't ask permission. I fished the key from my pocket. An old thing, brass worn smooth by years of being forgotten. It slid into the lock with a reluctant click. When I turned it, the metal groaned, a low, pained sound, as if waking from decades of sleep. The hatch lifted with a slow scrape, revealing a narrow stairway descending into cool darkness. I switched on my flashlight. The beam cut through the shadows, revealing concrete steps, damp stone walls, and the faint glimmer of water far below. I descended slowly, the air growing colder and sharper with each step. When my boots reached the bottom, the familiar smell hit me. Iron, earth, and slow-moving water. There it was. The valve chamber. A squat, formidable assembly of gears and steel sat anchored into the ground, exactly where my father had shown me decades ago. The brass placard was still bolted to its side, tarnished but legible. Emergency release system. Coal Lake authorized use. Landowner only certified 1983. Permit number 41. B. I ran my fingers over the raised lettering. Cold. Solid. True. This wasn't sabotage. This wasn't revenge. This was a system built into the lake from the beginning, engineered to protect land that couldn't protect itself. I positioned my flashlight on a ledge, angling it toward the valve. Then I pulled out my phone, opened the video camera, and hit record. My voice stayed steady, calm, measured. Name: Remy Cole, landowner of Cole Ranch. I'm documenting inspection of the emergency spillway installed in 1983 under Federal Hydrological Permit 41B. This system is part of certified infrastructure on private land. I recorded every inch of the valve, every bolt, every number stamped into the metal. The camera captured the seals, still intact. The rust pattern, still superficial. The drainage channel beneath, flowing slow and patient. If the HOA wanted to twist a narrative, I would twist nothing. I would give them the truth, in time-stamped clarity. I set my phone down and reached for the crank handle mounted on the wall. It looked smaller than I remembered, just a heavy iron rod with a leather grip hardened by time. I lifted it, feeling its weight, feeling the echoes of the day my father placed it in my hands. "Only turn it with purpose, Jean," he'd said. "Water remembers." I exhaled slowly. Tonight had purpose, but timing mattered. Midnight. That moment between days, where no one can argue you acted too early or too late, where the world seems to hold its breath. Midnight was the kind of time that made sense for something this old, this engineered, this deliberate. I waited. I climbed back up the steps, leaving the crank at the ready, and stepped into the icy air outside. The lake stretched before me, still lit by the HOA's flood lamps. Machinery glinted across its surface like metal teeth. I leaned against the shed, watching the minutes crawl by. At 11:42 p.m., a truck rumbled away from the site. At 11:50 p.m., the generators downshifted. At 11:57 p.m., a final figure. One contractor, likely checking meters, walked off the barge and headed up the trail toward the subdivision. The lake grew quiet again. No engines, no voices, just water, just night, just me. At 11:59 p.m., I stepped back into the hatchway, boots echoing down the steps. My heartbeat felt slow, steady, certain. I picked up the crank handle and fitted it into the valve slot. It clicked into place like it had been waiting for this exact moment. The second hand on my watch drifted upward. 12:00 a.m. Midnight. I braced my boot against the concrete wall and turned the crank. The valve groaned deep, a sound like a sleeping giant waking after decades underground. The metal shifted, resisted, then eased. Slow, measured, deliberate. Water surged quietly through the channel beneath, flowing into the old culvert system carved through the ridge. No splash, no roar, just the soft rush of gravity doing exactly what it was designed to do. I kept turning until the gauge hit the mark my father had etched on the metal. Then I stopped. I didn't smile. I didn't speak. I simply stood in the quiet and listened to the water moving beneath my feet. The lake had begun to change. Not yet visible. Not yet loud. Not yet noticeable from the HOA's perch. But the shift had started. And by sunrise, their power plant would be sitting on the wrong side of a very dry, very empty truth. The world outside was still ink black when I stepped out of the spillway tunnel. I closed the hatch gently, brushing dirt back over the metal edges until it looked as untouched as it had for 40 years. The cold night air wrapped around me like wet cloth, dense and motionless. Even the wind seemed unsure of itself, drifting in soft, broken breaths across the trees. I walked back toward the ranch house, boots scraping over frost-stiff grass. The lake loomed behind me, its surface still reflecting the white glare of the HOA's overnight floodlights. On the surface, nothing looked different yet. Water rarely announces its intentions. But underground, the old system was awake. Inside the house, I brewed a cup of coffee, though I barely tasted it. I sat at the kitchen table, listening to the quiet creaks in the walls, each one carrying a memory of my father's hands building this place board by board. The clock ticked toward dawn, At 5:30, the first subtle change appeared. A distant, hollow popping sound, like a rope snapping underwater, echoed across the lake. I stepped outside onto the porch, mug warming my hands. The floodlights on the opposite shore flickered once, maybe twice, as if confused by a shifting reflection. The machinery hummed at a different pitch, slightly thinner, struggling against something unseen. The lake was breathing out. By the time the horizon turned pale gray, the change could be seen with the naked eye. The waterline had retreated just far enough to expose a muddy strip along the bank, thin, dark, glistening in the newborn light. Reeds drooped at awkward angles, their roots half exposed like bones beneath skin. I walked down to the shoreline, each step sinking slightly as the softened earth gave way under my boots. The ducks circled overhead in uneasy formation, confused by the new geography of their home. Out on the lake, the barge listed to one side, ropes pulled tight, groaning under the shift. Then the sun crested the ridge, and everything changed at once. Light poured across the water, revealing what the darkness had been hiding. The shoreline had widened into a thick band of exposed mud. Stones emerged like old teeth. Driftwood lay marooned where the water had abandoned it. The reflection that usually shimmered across my living room window was gone, replaced by a dull brown stretch where water had sat untouched for decades. And the lake, my father's lake, was shrinking fast. Across the water, a worker on the barge noticed first. He leaned over the railing, squinting, then crouched to touch the air gap between the platform and the surface of the water. His shout echoed across the morning calm. "Hey, hey, the lake's dropped!" Another worker jogged to the edge, confused. He peered down, shook his head, then shouted toward the shore. A cluster of workers gathered, pointing, their voices rising in panicked bursts that carried across the thinning lake. I stayed where I was, hands in my pockets, breath steady. A truck engine sputtered to life on the far bank. Someone yelled for a supervisor. Radios crackled with static and broken sentences, and then, through the rising noise, came the unmistakable sound of a car accelerating down the subdivision trail. Bethany. Even from a distance, I recognized her posture the moment she stepped out of her SUV, ramrod straight, chin pointed like she was walking into court, not into a failing engineering fiasco. She slammed the door harder than necessary and marched toward the shoreline. Her shoes sank into the exposed mud with a sucking sound. She froze mid-step, staring down in disbelief, not just at the mud on her footwear, but at the mud itself. She hadn't expected to see it. No one had. I walked closer, not to greet her, but because the scene itself demanded witness. "What happened?" she snapped at the nearest worker. "Ma'am, the water level dropped overnight. A lot." "How much?" "Maybe 8-10 inches, and dropping. Fast." Bethany's eyes widened. "That's impossible. The project didn't touch anything that would—" "It's still falling," the worker said, wiping mud from his gloves. She spun around and spotted me standing on the slope above the shoreline. Her face stiffened into something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear, more like realization. "What did you do?" she demanded. "Operated my property," I said calmly. "This is sabotage. It's hydrological maintenance. Certified in 1983. I pointed toward the exposed shoreline. "The lake has a spillway, Bethany. Always has. Water levels fluctuate when it's used." "You drained it!" "No," I said, tilting my head slightly. "I activated a legally registered emergency runoff system. On my land. Using infrastructure built by my father. That system wasn't documented in our surveys. It's not HOA infrastructure. It's not community property. It's mine." Her breath grew sharp, each inhale clipped. "You're destroying our investment." "Your investment shouldn't have been on private land." Behind her, a worker's radio crackled again. "Ma'am, the turbines lost balance." We need immediate guidance. Bethany's face drained of color. She stepped closer, lowering her voice as if the wind might overhear. If that equipment is damaged, then you put it in the wrong place. This is criminal. Is it? I asked, lifting my brow. Or did you assume the lake was yours to build on before checking the law? Silence. A deep silence, heavy as stone. Another worker ran over, waving a clipboard. Ma'am, the foundation anchors are exposed. If the water keeps dropping, it will, I said. Bethany whipped around, glaring at me. How much? I shrugged lightly. Depends how much water needs to move through before the system stabilizes. She stared at me for a long, unblinking moment. Her jaw clenched, shoulders squared, breath rising and falling through her nose like a bull ready to charge. You've made a very big mistake, she said. So have you, I replied. You assumed ownership where you had none. More shouting erupted behind her. The barge tilted another degree. One of the turbines clanged like a loose bell, half suspended over receding water. I watched the scene unfold with a calmness I had earned the hard way. Not triumphant, not smug, just certain. This was never about revenge. This was about truth, the kind you can't bend, vote on, or gaslight away. The kind written into land deeds and buried below old sheds. The kind my father left me so I'd never have to raise my voice to defend what was mine. Across the thinning lake, Bethany finally yelled the words I'd been expecting all morning. Call the sheriff! And for the first time in days, I allowed myself a breath that felt almost like relief. Because the sheriff coming out here was the best thing that could happen. For both of us. Especially now that the lake itself had joined the argument. The first patrol truck rolled over the ridge just as the sun finally broke free of the clouds, washing the shrinking lake in pale Wyoming light. The dew still clung to the brittle winter grass, scattering diamonds under the sheriff's headlights. The engine rumbled low and steady, a sound that carried authority without needing to shout. Sheriff Marcus Hale stepped out, adjusting the brim of his hat as he surveyed the chaos before him. Marcus wasn't just the sheriff. He'd been a neighbor of my family since I was barely old enough to lift a fishing pole. He knew the land. He knew the lake. And he knew my father. But Marcus was also a fair man. He didn't take sides on assumption. If anything, he grew sterner when it involved people he knew. He stood there for a long moment, boots planted, hands on his hips, gaze tracing the exposed shoreline, the half-stranded barge, the workers scrambling like ants, and finally, the furious figure of Bethany Reed pacing near the water's edge. His eyes narrowed. Then he walked down the slope toward her. Bethany spotted him and went straight for the offensive. "Sheriff, arrest him," she demanded, pointing her clipboard at me like a weapon. "He sabotaged a community energy project. He drained the lake on purpose. This is criminal property destruction." Marcus didn't even flinch. "Morning, Bethany." "This isn't a morning, this is an emergency. It's barely 8 o'clock. She stomped closer, mud splattering her polished slacks. "Sheriff, he activated some kind of underground valve system and collapsed our entire infrastructure. Look." She gestured wildly at the listing barge. "People could have been hurt." "And were they?" Marcus asked calmly. Bethany sputtered. "Not yet, but..." "Good." He turned to the workers. "Everyone accounted for?" A foreman nodded. "Yes, sir. Equipment's damaged. No injuries." Marcus nodded once. "Then let's slow down. Nobody's getting arrested until I understand what I'm looking at." He finally turned to me. "Morning, Remy." I gave him a small nod. "Sheriff?" "You want to tell me what happened?" Before I could speak, a second vehicle pulled up, a white SUV with state plates and an emblem I recognized instantly. Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality. 2 inspectors stepped out, one man and one woman, carrying clipboards and wearing the kind of practical boots that meant they expected mud. The woman approached Marcus, offering a brief handshake. Sheriff Hale, we received multiple calls about unauthorized lake disturbance and possible wetland impact. Bethany's eyes lit up with vindication. Yes, that's exactly what this is. I kept quiet. The inspector scanned the scene for several seconds before asking the most important question of the morning. Who is the landowner? I raised a hand. That'd be me. Her gaze shifted toward Bethany. And the HOA was operating machinery on your lake? Bethany stiffened. It's community infrastructure. We voted. Ma'am, voting doesn't override deeded property rights, the inspector said bluntly. Bethany blinked, hard. I stepped forward, speaking evenly. This lake was built by my father in 1979. I have the original deed, the plat map, and the federal registration for the water control system they built across. I nodded toward the ridge. I can show all of it. The inspector's brows lifted slightly. You have registered infrastructure. In my bag, I said, tapping the waterproof case over my shoulder. Fully documented, including the emergency spillway system. Bethany whipped toward me. Emergency spillway? You never disclosed any of... Because it's not HOA business, I cut in gently. It's private, always has been. Marcus exhaled through his nose, slow, measured. Let's head up to the house, he said. We'll review documents. Bethany stomped forward again. No, absolutely not. Sheriff, you're not listening. He drained the lake. Our equipment is destroyed. He created a safety hazard. Bethany, Marcus said, raising his hand in a gesture that was somehow patient and immovable at the same time. If his infrastructure is legally registered, if the lake is his, and if he activated his own system on his own land, then what he did is not sabotage. She froze. But sabotage means damaging property you don't own. If this land is his, he looked at me. Then, he exercised a landowner's right. The inspector added quietly, and if the HOA built on private land, that's a trespass violation. Possibly several. Bethany's mouth opened, then shut again, jaw trembling with suppressed rage. I turned and began the walk back up toward the ranch house. Marcus and the inspectors followed, their footsteps crunching the frost. Bethany reluctantly trudged behind, every step punctuated by a splatter of mud and an audible huff. Her clipboard flapped at her side like a frustrated bird. Inside the house, sunlight poured across my father's old oak table. I laid out everything. The original deed, the survey lines, the 1979 construction photographs, the federal spillway registration, and a notarized history of water rights. The inspector flipped carefully through each page, pausing at the brass plate photo of the spillway valve. This is legitimate, she murmured, and still active. Marcus looked to Bethany. Your turn. Show me the permit for construction on private property. Bethany's face drained of color. We relied on a proposed overlay. Our consultants... Proposed overlay, Marcus repeated. Not approved? She swallowed hard. Marcus leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. Bethany, you authorized construction on a lake that doesn't belong to the HOA. That lake should belong to the community, she snapped. It sits right by our greenbelt. It benefits all of us. It's practically part of the neighborhood. That isn't how property law works, the inspector said flatly. Bethany clutched her clipboard like a shield. Sheriff, you have to understand. He's been uncooperative since the beginning. He doesn't attend meetings. He doesn't support neighborhood initiatives. Marcus raised an eyebrow, none of which gives you the right to build on his land. Bethany shook her head, refusing to let go of her narrative. Remy manipulated the situation. He weaponized that old system to destroy our project. I gently closed the document folder. No, Bethany. Your project destroyed itself the moment you ignored the deed. Silence filled the room like settling dust. The inspector scribbled something, then spoke. Effective immediately, we're issuing a suspension on all HOA activities related to the lake pending full investigation. Bethany gasped. Suspension? You can't. And, the inspector added, if we find that construction occurred on private land without proper permitting, the HOA could face significant fines, possibly a full project shutdown. Marcus stood. We'll escort the site workers off the property. Bethany's voice cracked. This isn't fair. Marcus looked at her with a calm, weary sympathy. Fairness starts with respecting the lines drawn on a map. You crossed one. I watched her face shift through denial, anger, shock, and finally something fragile. Fear. The inspector turned to me. Mr. Cole, do you intend to restore the lake levels? Yes, I said. Once equipment is removed and the shoreline is safe. Good. That's reasonable. Bethany shook her head, staring at me with something colder than anger. This isn't over, she whispered. I met her gaze calmly. No, I said, but it's finally turning the right direction. We stepped outside together, the cold morning wind sweeping across the exposed basin. The workers gathered their tools, climbing onto trucks as Marcus directed them toward the access road. The lake was quiet. Emptier, yes, but honest in its bareness. The bones of the land were visible, and for the first time in months, it felt like the truth didn't have to fight anymore. Because the law had arrived. Because the land had spoken. Because the HOA's story had finally cracked open under its own weight. The sheriff tipped his hat toward me as he climbed into his truck. Remy, you did what you had to. I nodded. And I'll finish what I started. Bethany stood alone near the shore, staring at the wrecked barge as if hoping the water might rush back out of pity. But the lake wasn't listening to her. It never had. By the next morning, the air over West Ridge felt heavy in a different way. Not the weight of a winter storm, but something quieter, more decisive. Word had already traveled through the neighborhood. Inspectors were on site. The sheriff had intervened. And the HOA's shiny new power plant had died before it ever lived. People weren't exactly taking sides yet, but they were whispering. I could feel the shift when I walked down my driveway toward my truck. Neighbors who hadn't made eye contact with me in months suddenly offered silent nods, small, cautious gestures that said we heard something happened, and maybe you weren't the villain after all. Still, this wasn't over. The emergency meeting was scheduled for noon. HOA Board, County Survey Office, Environmental Compliance, my attorney, Sarah Mitchell, and me. A full room, the kind where truth either stands tall or gets buried under paperwork. I arrived 10 minutes early, deed folder under my arm, the same one my father kept in the safe behind the old barn wall, wrapped in oilcloth, protected like a family heirloom. It felt heavier today. Not just because of what was inside, but because of what it represented. Ownership. Responsibility. History. Everything Bethany had tried to overwrite with a vote and a smile. The HOA conference hall sat behind the clubhouse. A long rectangular room filled with folding tables, fluorescent lights that hummed, and a whiteboard stained with the ghost of meetings past. The place smelled faintly of coffee that had burned too long on a warmer. Board members sat at the front behind a narrow table. Their faces looked drained, shoulders tense. A few residents filled the plastic chairs behind me, curious, uneasy, hungry for answers. Bethany arrived last. Her usually polished blazer was wrinkled. Her hair was pulled too tightly into a bun. She carried a thick binder under her arm, but she clutched it the way someone holds an umbrella during a lightning storm. Not with confidence, but with desperation. She sat in the middle of the board table, spine rigid. The meeting opened with a forced, brittle quiet. "Let's come to order," muttered Greg, the HOA treasurer, clearing his throat. "We're here to address the situation with the lake. My lake." I corrected gently. Every head turned. Bethany's jaw tightened. We will discuss ownership once we have clarity from zoning, and you'll have clarity? Sarah's voice cut in from the back as she stepped forward. And you'll have it now. She laid 3 documents on the table with the confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime watching arguments dissolve under the weight of facts. The first was the original deed, recorded, sealed, stamped. The second, the 1979 to 1980 construction permit and water control registration. The third, a certified boundary map from the county, issued only an hour earlier. Everything perfectly aligned, everything undisputed. Sarah tapped the edge of the map. This is the official property line. The lake sits entirely inside the Cole Ranch boundary. There is no greenbelt overlay. There is no disputed zone. There is no community claim. This is private land. The room was so still, the fluorescent hum felt louder. Bethany blinked. Our consultants said, "Your consultants were incorrect," said a county surveyor from the side table. This map supersedes anything your HOA proposed or speculated about. No boundary change was ever approved. A board member at the far end whispered, "Oh, God." Another muttered something about liability. Bethany's face flushed as she straightened in her chair. The community voted. The community, Sarah said calmly, cannot vote to seize private property. A resident let out a low breath. Another covered his mouth with his hand. The treasurer glanced nervously at Bethany. This doesn't look good. It's an unlawful construction, the county representative added. You poured foundations on private land. That exposes the HOA to fines and civil penalties. And damages, Sarah said. Significant ones. Bethany slammed her hand down on the table. He drained the lake. He destroyed our infrastructure. I activated a federally registered spillway system, I replied evenly, on my land, with paperwork to prove it. The environmental inspector nodded. We confirmed that yesterday. Everything Mr. Cole did was legal. Bethany stared at me with disbelief. Real disbelief. Like she had built an entire worldview on the assumption that I would break first, bend first, or yield to her authority. But the world had shifted under her feet, and her footing collapsed with it. The county rep reached for the next document. Given this evidence, we are issuing a formal stop work order on all HOA activities related to the lake. Murmurs broke out behind me. Sarah wasn't finished. And now, she said, sliding one last folder toward the board, we're presenting the damages claim. Bethany stiffened. Damages? You trespassed, Sarah replied. You constructed a power plant on private property. You refused documented evidence of ownership, and you posted signs declaring his land as yours. She paused. There will be a settlement hearing, and possibly more. Bethany's voice cracked. This is outrageous. It's the law, Sarah said quietly. Then came the moment, the one the entire meeting had been orbiting. I opened the deed folder myself. The old paper smelled faintly of cedar, dust, and the oil my father rubbed into the leather cover decades ago. I set the deed down in the center of the table. Its weight thudded softly. No dramatic flourish, no anger, no raised voice. Just the truth, placed where everyone could see it. The room fell silent, eyes locked on the page. The original signature, the seal, the date, the boundaries, all of it undeniable, all of it final. Bethany stared at it, as if the lines and seals and signatures might rearrange themselves into something that could save her. They didn't. For the first time since this entire nightmare began, she had no words, not a single one. The HOA treasurer spoke instead, his voice cracking just slightly. We accept the deed as valid. The county rep nodded. The project is suspended. The environmental inspector followed. And under review. Sarah simply folded her arms with the patience of someone who had known all along where this would end. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly, letting the relief move through me like warm sunlight thawing ice. The meeting adjourned in stunned quiet. The board members shuffled out. Residents lingered, whispering. The inspectors packed their bags. The county official spoke briefly with one last reminder of legal obligations. Everyone moved around the table like they were avoiding the deed, afraid to touch it. Bethany remained seated. Still, silent, defeated. When I finally stood to leave, she looked up at me, eyes strained, voice barely above a breath. "You ruined everything." "No," I said softly. "You just learned what you never owned." Outside, the Wyoming wind swept across the half-empty lake bed, carrying the cold scent of exposed earth and quiet justice. Everything was changing now. Boundaries, power, perception. This fight wasn't about draining water. It was about filling the void left when someone tries to rewrite truth. And the truth had just landed on the table, stamped and sealed for all to see. The meeting room emptied slowly, like a storm losing momentum. People drifted out in small, stunned clusters, quiet voices, lowered heads, stolen glances in my direction. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The only sound left after the last whisper faded. Outside, the Wyoming sun had shifted westward, casting long shadows across the dirt lot behind the clubhouse. The wind had picked up, brushing dust into small spirals that danced over the asphalt before disappearing. It smelled of pine and cold stone and something lighter, like the land itself was easing its shoulders. I walked to my truck without looking back. The leather folder stayed tucked under my arm, warm against the chill air. The deed inside somehow felt heavier now, as if acknowledging the fight it had just survived. When I reached the ridge above the lake, I stopped. The basin spread out beneath me, wide, dark, raw. The waterline sat low, leaving a band of exposed earth that glistened like polished obsidian. What had once been concealed beneath 10 feet of water was now visible. Roots, rocks, old logs my father had sunk for fish habitat decades ago. At the center, the wrecked power barge leaned hopelessly in the mud. Its metal frame bent in all the places pressure didn't forgive mistakes. A place that had once hummed with unwanted construction now sat still, unmoving, undeniable, just the way it was always meant to be. A pickup rolled down the access road. For a moment, I thought it was Marcus again, but it was one of the county trucks. 2 workers stepped out in heavy jackets and gloves, carrying bright yellow tape and long steel stakes. They climbed down to the shoreline and began marking a perimeter around the barge. I watched them work. Slow, methodical movements, the kind of caution that meant whatever was happening next wasn't going to be small. Then another truck appeared, and another, and an SUV behind them. The lake bed was becoming an investigation site. I stayed back on the ridge, hands in my pockets, watching the official dance unfold. From the corner of my eye, a familiar SUV pulled up behind my truck. Sarah stepped out, wrapping her scarf tighter around her neck as the wind pushed her hair across her face. "You did good in there," she said softly, walking up beside me. "I just told the truth. Sometimes that's the hardest thing to get people to hear." We stood there in silence a while, looking at the exposed basin below. She finally asked, "You ready for what comes next?" "I think so." "You know the HOA will need to settle this, publicly. They'll have to issue a statement, retract the Greenbelt claim, pay damages, compensate for trespass, remove equipment." Her voice trailed off. She didn't need to list it all. I already knew. But the strange part was, I wasn't thinking about damages or apologies or legal victories. I was thinking about my father, kneeling in the mud 40 years ago, hands covered in clay and grit, as he shaped the lake with stubborn patience. I was thinking about him tightening bolts on the spillway valve, saying, Build it like it has to outlast the people who forget why you built it. And it had. Sarah glanced at me. You're quiet. Just remembering, I said. She nodded. Want me to handle communications with the HOA? I'd appreciate it. I'll draft everything. They won't have many options left. Another gust blew across the ridge, stirring dust around our boots. Down below, the investigators circled the barge, taking photos. I watched them a moment longer before saying, let's go check the shoreline. We walked the slope together, the earth soft beneath our boots. The closer we got, the colder the air felt. Some combination of exposed soil and the eerie stillness of a lake holding its breath. When we reached the bottom, I knelt, pressing my palm against the cool mud. It felt firm now, settling. No longer a battlefield, no longer resisting, just returning to its natural order. Sarah stood beside me, arms crossed. It's strange, she murmured. Quiet, peaceful. Peaceful is all it should have ever been. We were joined by a soft cough behind us. Bethany. She looked smaller, not physically, but in presence, like the fight had drained something she didn't know how to refill. Her eyes were red, though she tried to hold her posture straight. Mud clung to the hem of her pants. Her clipboard was gone. She carried nothing now. Remy, she said, barely above the wind. Bethany! She swallowed, the motion tightening her jaw. I came to... Look. Her gaze drifted to the stranded barge, the mangled supports. I didn't think it would end like this. You didn't think it would end, I said. There's a difference. She winced, but didn't argue. Instead, she looked down at her hands. This job, this HOA, it's supposed to keep things orderly, predictable, safe. I thought I was doing what was right for the community. By taking someone else's land. Her shoulders slumped. By pushing too hard. By not listening. By assuming I knew better. She took a shaky breath. I lost sight of the line. I nodded. Happens. But the land remembers. She stared out at the lakebed. They want me to resign. That's between you and them. That deed, I didn't know. I didn't want to know. I convinced myself it wouldn't matter. Her voice cracked. It mattered. I didn't speak. Some moments don't need words. Finally, she whispered, I'm sorry. It wasn't loud. It wasn't grand. It wasn't meant for the crowd. There wasn't one. Just the lake, the wind, and the truth. I nodded once. That was enough. She turned and walked away, leaving only the faint imprint of her footsteps in the damp earth. Sarah watched her go. That apology is worth more than she realizes. Maybe. Are you going to accept it? I already did. A long quiet settled between us. Then, from across the basin, one of the county workers called out, We're marking the equipment for removal. Should be done within a week. I raised a hand in acknowledgement. Sarah smiled. Looks like your lake is coming home. Piece by piece. We walked back toward the ridge. The air felt warmer now, the sun pushing through the last thin veil of clouds. When I reached the top, I paused and looked down one last time. The lake was empty, but it wasn't defeated. It was breathing, resting, waiting. And it would return. When I got back to the house, I unlocked the old storage shed near the pine line. Inside, the smell of cedar and dust wrapped around me like a memory. I found the steel wrench my father always used, a thick, heavy tool meant for stubborn valves and stubborn seasons. I carried it down to the spillway access and opened the hatch. The cool air rising from below smelled of stone and old metal, a place that had existed quietly beneath the surface long before HOA votes and survey stakes. I knelt, fitting the wrench onto the secondary intake bolts. They turned with steady resistance, each rotation sending a low, resonant vibration through the chamber. The lake began to drink again. Water trickled along the channel, slow but certain. When I climbed out, I tightened the hatch bolts and placed the new steel plate over them, custom cut, polished, etched. Private lake federally certified infrastructure. Trespass subject to prosecution. And beneath it, a line just for me. You are not entitled to what you do not own. That evening, I sat on the shoreline as the first thin layer of water spread across the basin, catching the sunset in a soft orange sheen. The quiet was absolute. No generators, no hammering, no floodlights. Just the sound of returning water and the distant rustle of pine trees swaying in the Wyoming dusk. The lake would fill again, slowly, patiently, the way my father designed it. And in that slow return, every inch of water carried the same message. Ownership isn't noise. It's stewardship. It's responsibility. It's knowing what is yours and protecting it when tested. And when the last light faded over the ridge, turning the sky indigo, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Justice didn't roar here. It settled, quiet as water, deep as legacy, and clear as the lake that would soon shine again under the Wyoming sun. Sometimes justice doesn't shout. It just stands its ground, the way good land and good people do. If you've ever had to defend what's yours, drop a justice in the comments. And if these stories speak to you, I'd be honored to have you subscribe and ride along for the next one.